Bidirectional charging is the ability for them to take the electricity from their roofs, store it in their cars, and then power their homes. I believe it might be one of the largest wealth transfers from the corporate world to consumers that we've seen. You don't have to upgrade your house. You don't have to change your wiring. The only two things that you need is a car that can support it,
Okay, we'll come
and
back
a
to that.
charger that can support it. That's it. And when you go back to China, and I'm from Shanghai, every car's electric. It's crazy. In the year 2050, how many vehicle sales in the passenger segment will be hydrogen?
What's it like running one of Australia's preeminent climate tech companies as a husband and wife team?
It's fun. Like, it's a very anticlimactic answer.
Yeah.
How much of EV sales growth has been reliant on subsidies?
All right, Tim Washington, welcome
Hi.
back to A Positive Climate, your second time on.
Absolutely, and in full HD. So
You can watch this on YouTube, perhaps. We'll see what happens with it. 3 years ago, somehow, when you were last on,
Yes.
we started that podcast by asking, why should people care about electric vehicles? So let's start this one the same way. Why should people care about vehicle to grid?
why should people care about vehicle to grid? I honestly think the reason people should care is because I believe it might be one of the largest wealth transfers from the corporate world to consumers that we've seen in recent days. And the reason I say that is because it's not often that a technology comes along and saves pretty much your entire fuel bill and also has the potential to save the vast majority of your household bill, and all of that money stays in the consumer pocket. I think that's why they should care. I mean, if you look at most bills that people have, whether it's rent or a mortgage, after that, a lot of it is transport and energy.
Yep.
And I think in the modern world where literally every dollar counts, I think people should get excited about having additional budget because they haven't had to spend it on fuel or on their energy costs. And that's what vehicle to home, I would say, bidirectional charging is actually going to unlock, is the ability for them to take the electricity from their roofs, store it in their cars, and then power their homes.
Yep. Well, we're going to unpack all of that on the episode today. But I suppose there'll never be vehicle to grid or home if there's no electric vehicles on the road.
Yeah.
So it's probably worth starting with a bit of a check-in on how electric vehicle uptake is going. Let's talk about Australia and then we can move to the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Australia, we're just under 10% of new vehicle sales.
Yeah.
And whether that's kind of in line with what we thought, it's probably a little bit behind. But these things, they'll catch up pretty quickly. The big difference now, I think, thematically, between today and when we spoke 3 years ago.
I think we're at 1.1% back then or close to 2 perhaps.
Yeah. I think the percentages are important. I also think that the players are also important because 3 years ago, if you asked your average EV industry pundit, right, what kind of brands are going to be leading our journey from, say, 8% of new vehicle sales to 50% of new vehicle sales, it would have been the same names like Tesla, Volkswagen, Hyundai, Kia, like all of these names, right? But I think if you ask the average industry pundit today, who are going to be the players to actually lead that race to 50%, I think definitely Tesla will still be there. But I think there'll be some new names on the list.
Yep.
And, like BYD and the upcoming Chinese brands, including people like MG, Chery, like all of these guys. And increasingly over the past 3 years, I've found myself changing the market of comparison for where Australia is going to go in the future.
Okay.
Because do you remember, you've been doing this for a while as well, Nick, people often refer to Norway.
Yeah, the Scandinavians.
Scandinavians,
I think
right.
Will Ferrell was talking about Scandinavia in that funny ad that we'll link in the show notes.
Talk about Europe. Talk about California and parts of the US. But what we've seen in recent years is they found that they've started falling behind.
Okay.
And
Like they hit a plateau.
they've hit a plateau. And because their local manufacturers are not driving innovation fast enough or have faced issues retooling kind of like their original factories. And so now they're putting tariffs on the Chinese-made vehicles.
Yep.
And of course, that piques your curiosity. So you look at the Chinese market, which is incredibly opaque to the Western world. Me being Chinese originally, we go back to China every year. And in China, they're about to hit over 50% of new vehicle sales
Wow.
being electric. It is also the largest car market in the world. And, you know, I can say, I guess, from a Chinese cultural perspective, that a lot of it, like frugality does play a key role, so it has to hit the right price point. And when you go back to China, and I'm from Shanghai, every car's electric. It's crazy. Every car's electric, and 95% of the vehicles on the road that you see visually, don't know the stats exactly, but you see visually, are not from a Western brand, with the possible exception of Tesla.
Yeah.
And so then you go, okay, well, if the vast majority of electric cars in Australia are made in China, including Tesla, and if China has more than 50% of new vehicle sales, and we don't place tariffs on Chinese EVs, is the Chinese market actually a better market
As a comparator.
as a comparison, than the European and US markets? And there's a lot happening in politics at the moment, as you know.
Yep.
So who knows what's going to happen in those markets?
Yep.
But if the vast majority of our EVs do come from China, do we care? I think numbers are important, but I also think that the players are probably quite important as well, because if the players are no longer the traditional players and they're more the Chinese players, and the Chinese players only make EVs, then the journey from 10% to 50% to 100% might actually happen much faster than we think.
And with that unlock lower prices. Obviously, there's been such a discussion that we've had over the years about what the tipping point will be when consumers finally go, yes, like I can earn back the delta or the improvement in refueling costs and servicing costs. If I can get that back in 2 years, then okay, then I'll be able to buy an EV. But certainly, it seems like it's closer to when the upfront costs match up. There's obviously, you know, a lot of other issues around charging, etc. But will it just be lower cost models that pull us through?
Oh, I think it's mostly price. I honestly think it's mostly price. Because, you know, the Chinese-made vehicles coming in, they're not the cheapest vehicles in the market, because those still belong to the really small hatchbacks. But there's not many of them around anymore. Like, you can't actually go out and buy a $20,000 new car anymore. Do you know what I mean? Like, some of these cars, they're $45,000, they're $40,000, they're $50,000. That's pretty much in line with average car prices in Australia. And then you look at, obviously, the servicing savings and the fuel savings. I feel like on a price level, we're already there. But I think there's two things to this. The first is, we've seen what happens when you hit price parity in Australia already. EV sales are going pretty well. Where are they coming from? A lot of them are coming from the novated lease market. And in the novated leasing market, because the federal government gave a fringe benefits tax exemption, it basically meant that if you can lease a car through your company and it comes out of your pre-tax salary, an electric car is now on parity or cheaper than a petrol car.
Yep, absolutely.
It's cheaper. And so then what happened? Then novated leasing companies, their forward order book went from 2-3%, whatever is normal for that time, to 30 to 50% of the forward order book, right, are now electric cars. So that says to me that once we hit price parity, or even a little bit cheaper, 50% of Australians, right, have said, I'll get an electric car.
Yep.
Nothing else has changed, right? Like, charging infrastructure doesn't double for those people, right? Like, all the anxiety around range and battery health, like, none of that has changed. The only thing that's changed is price, and 50% of Australians have said yes. So that's pretty interesting to me.
Yep.
The second thing, we're starting to see a wave of novated leasing for second-hand electric vehicles as well. And that's pretty interesting to me because there's a lot of talk around how much depreciation and, how hard it is to kind of get a residual value for electric cars. But if 3/4 of Australians never buy a new vehicle, they buy used vehicles, right? So we sell 1 million new cars a year. We sell 3 to 4 million used cars a year. Those people are getting into electric cars for the first time as well. And the cheaper those electric cars become, the easier it is for them to buy an electric car as well.
Yep.
We've got 15, 17 million cars in Australia. You're going to see that number of electric vehicles as a proportion of that go up pretty quickly because of all those things.
Could we talk about EV charging infrastructure, though? Obviously, this is your sweet spot. You run Australia's leading charging infrastructure business. Where are we at with charging availability? Do consumers still care or think about range anxiety, or that's lessening?
I think consumers 95% of the time don't suffer the same range anxiety that they did 3 years ago, right?
Yep.
I think trips these days are easier. I think there's a lot more charging infrastructure out there, and each charging station, if you like, is getting more ports. There is that 5% of the time when it's really busy during holiday periods where people go, oh, I wonder if it's going to be full, right?
Yep.
That charger. But it's actually the same problem as we face on the grid. Do you build for maximum capacity if it means 95% of the time you're losing money? Like, what do you do, right? And so I think there is that balance. The federal government, as well as state governments and corporates, have just putting in a lot of money into public charging infrastructure. And we can see from we normally plan about a year ahead in terms of our pipe. And so we can see from our pipeline that there is going to be a lot more to come.
Okay.
And I think the charging infrastructure is becoming more reliable. I actually think you see less talk these days of broken chargers everywhere. I think if you just look at how technology evolves, it becomes better.
Yep.
It just genuinely becomes better. We're starting to see the kind of uptimes on our networks are getting much, much better.
Yep.
And it's very encouraging. I think it's also people understand the need for maintenance, for, making sure that someone's looking at it 24/7, all of those things. And there's much stricter standards on hardware selection. The kind of questions we go through when we're pitching hardware now is insane. It's like, a kind of a university semester worth of questions, right? So, which is really actually quite good because it means that people care. So I think charging availability is getting much better, especially in public. And I think it's giving people a lot more confidence to buy EVs.
Awesome. Well, that sets a good foundation. Let's move on to the topic at hand, which is effectively to answer the question, will our cars power our homes? Maybe if you can just set out in layman's terms, what are we actually talking about here? How does vehicle to grid or home actually work?
So the concept itself is actually really simple. We've used batteries to power stuff for a long time. And the fact that the batteries are in your car rather than a pack of Duracell AA's, for example, it shouldn't make a difference to how we think about it. You can charge batteries and you can use batteries. And essentially what bidirectional charging or vehicle to home, vehicle to grid does is it says, instead of charging your vehicle, let's use the batteries in the vehicle, not for the car, but to power something else. And so that's kind of pretty much what we're talking about, using that electricity in the vehicle to power other things, including your home.
We mentioned a few times vehicle to home, vehicle to grid. Is there a difference there?
I think the concept of vehicle to grid, I think just visually it's the wrong image. Because the image of vehicle to grid, kind of like you imagine a cable and it goes directly into the grid. It's kind of weird.
Yeah.
And the other...
You don't say solar to grid.
You don't say solar to grid.
Yeah.
I don't think you say solar to home either, though. But vehicle to grid immediately conjures up this image of someone using your car for the grid. And it almost has nothing to do with you.
Yep.
So it's very impersonal.
Yep.
And I think people push back on it. I think terminology matters.
Absolutely.
They push back on it because they go, my car's not here to support the grid. My car's here to support me, right? So I think these terms are they're all engineering terms more so. So I think vehicle to home is probably the more pertinent example, right?
And how would consumers actually, how would this actually appear for consumers? Like what kit or charging cables would be needed for them to actually do this?
Yeah. This is the thing that I really love about bidirectional charging and vehicle to home is that for the consumer, there's almost nothing to do. You don't have to upgrade your house. You don't have to change your wiring. Your electricity cables carry electricity both ways. It doesn't really care which way it goes. The only two things that you need is a car that can support it
Okay, we'll come
and
back
a
to that.
charger that can support it. That's it. So for people listening to this podcast who already have an electric vehicle and they already have a charging station at home, it's just going to be another charging station that you plug in.
Yep.
And that's it. There's not going to be like a red button next to the charging station that goes charge, discharge, and you have to press a button to change the flow. It's all done automatically. Works with your existing solar system. So there's not much that has to change, just the car and the charger.
And where's the technology actually up to, though? Like we'll talk about the future in a second around when this actually becomes real for customers. But does it work? Is it proven?
It works. It works, and it's proven. It's interesting because people say, well, when's bidirectional charging going to work? And the thing is, like, we've been able to take electricity out of cars for quite a long time now. JetCharge, we've done probably about 70 bidirectional charging stations in Australia.
Yep.
Like, we've already rolled out, probably more than 70. We've already rolled them out. They're being used for bidirectional purposes every day.
Mainly for fleets, though?
No, there's quite a few in homes now.
Okay.
And our partners, Amber, they've got 3 customers, I think, with bidirectional charging stations already.
Wow.
And I think it's pretty crazy because people think that there's a lot of development work to do on the actual power technology. There isn't. Almost all of the development is to do with communications, regulatory compliance, and security.
Not business models?
Well, of course, there has to be something to do with business models.
Yeah.
Business models and EV charging sometimes don't mix, Nick.
Take your word for it, Tim.
So we're already able to do bidirectional charging in Australia on the CHAdeMO plug standard. Now, as you know, like the CHAdeMO plug standard is being replaced by CCS2, and there's really only the Nissan Leaf, Mitsubishi Outlander, and Eclipse Cross who are capable of doing it. And Nissan Leaf has reached end of life, that they actually just announced. Essentially, we can already do it. The big question is, when are we going to be able to get CCS2, which is the kind of charging standard that we use these days for vehicles, compliant bidirectional charging stations? They are already available at a prototype level overseas, and they're just basically being used as tests. Renault and BMW will be the first cabs off the rank with a proprietary system for bidirectional charging.
Yep. But is that
Already
in the
happening.
car or is that a external charger?
Good question.
Yeah.
It's an external charging station.
Because a lot of the stuff that I read, there's like a debate going on about whether there could be something on board and then you lose the need and the cost, etc., for having an external charger. And we'll talk about cost and payback in a second. But I'd love to know like your take on what is winning or might win out there in terms of that debate and how the AC versus DC concept actually fits in.
Absolutely. So at the moment, the ones that are being installed in market, especially in overseas markets, require a more expensive DC wall box on the wall.
Okay.
There's a few reasons for that. The first is because it's easier for compliance, because when it's on the wall, it's the charger manufacturer who certifies it. When it's in the car, it's the car manufacturer who has to certify it. And so for all car manufacturers, the name of the game is standardization. The more you can standardize for a global market, the cheaper it is for you to produce that car.
Yep.
The idea of then having to have different designs that's compliant with different grid codes around the world is less appealing. There are some companies that just focus purely on their home markets, US, Europe, whatever, China. Some of the vehicle manufacturers are pretty relaxed and they want to include the bidirectional charger inside the car to save costs for the consumer. The fact of the matter is that the standards currently are set and accepted for DC wall boxes, and there's still some development work to go on the AC wall boxes. So I actually think in the future there will be a place for both. It's just a big question of like timing.
Yeah.
And I think timing is definitely going to be DC wall box first.
Okay. Well, let's keep talking about the car maker's perspective here. Like, is there a concern about when you use vehicle to grid, there's actually degradation or accelerated degradation on the battery?
Intuitively, yes. So intuitively, if you think about it, you're like, well, the more I use these batteries, the more it's going to degrade, right? And I think the vehicle manufacturers who we've already worked with have guidelines on how much you can use the vehicle for a battery.
Okay.
I think from a kind of top-down perspective, it's really, I would say, important to say that drawing electricity out of the battery for your home is the equivalent of putting your foot down on the accelerator at a very low speed, right?
Okay.
Because the draw is quite gentle. If you think about the average power, even for a small car, right, it's quite a lot, over 100 kilowatts sometimes, right? Whereas when you're doing vehicles, it's 7 kilowatts. And so you're literally drawing 7 kilowatts out of the battery. And so it could be higher, but generally speaking, homes it's 7 kilowatts. And so it's quite gentle. Nissan, for example, have a guideline where you can do 1 cycle per day for vehicle to grid or vehicle to home, right? Which is enough for households without voiding the warranty.
We always have to say it, Tim. We always have to ask the question, what's Tesla's take on all of this? I know they've been flipping and flopping, but we can't do an episode about electric vehicles without saying the words Elon Musk.
Yes. Who knows, right? I've honestly given up on trying to predict what they will do, and I just roll with the punches.
Yeah.
So publicly, they've said previously that they won't support it, but this year they said they're going to enable it from 2025. We think, based on industry kind of scuttlebutt, that they will probably go for an AC solution where they'll build the onboard charger
More
integrated into the vehicle. But that's just conjecture. I don't actually have any insider information on that. And
just
so,
scuttlebutt, as you said.
Just scuttlebutt.
Okay.
Yeah. Just speculation.
Okay.
But who knows? Like you actually just don't know. It could get pushed back. It could never happen, or it could happen sooner. You just don't know. I think they will support it. I think if it becomes expected from consumers that this is a feature, then you have to do it. And if you look at the Cybertruck, for example, they already support vehicle to load. So they've already got like that capability inside the vehicle.
Wow, yep.
I think it's a NEMA 1450 plug in the Cybertruck from memory, which is like an industrial power point almost. And so you can draw like really fast discharge rates to charge another vehicle. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's like 15 kilowatts or 20 kilowatts or something like that. Yep. So it's a case of business model, I would say, more so than technology.
Okay. So let's do this. Let's talk about the consumer perspective. I guess the fundamental premise in my mind has always been, okay, like we've got a vehicle, it's in the garage or on the street, and we use that 5% of the time. So there's all this opportunity where the other 95% where you could do something with it. I suppose that relies on a bit of an assumption that consumers will actually be willing to offer up control of their vehicle. Like, is that being tested, that projects you've been involved with, that consumers either are completely unconcerned that there's some other interaction of their vehicle going on behind the scenes and they possibly might wake up with a less charged vehicle than what they thought it would?
It hasn't been tested.
Because it feels like the fundamental premise that we're relying on. And maybe they might not notice, and we'll talk about how it could actually work. But I just sort of always come back to, do they want this? And will it be a fundamental behaviour shift that they're going to need to get used to make it happen?
I think it's what everyone's trying to predict. And it's not only in electric vehicles. It's also in home batteries.
Yeah.
It's also in solar inverters. So I don't really try and predict the future with a crystal ball. I tend to look at just existing behaviour in relation to other things to come to a logical conclusion of what's going to happen in the future.
Yep.
All things are possible with time. So behaviours change over time and consumer expectations change over time. The big question is, over the next, like, say, medium to long term, 10 years, 15 years, what's going to happen? I think in the next 50 years, anything can happen. But what's going to happen in the kind of short term? And I'm not absolutely convinced that beyond the early adopter crowd, I absolutely think that the very engaged, I would say, not necessarily geeky, but
People that listen to this podcast, is that what
people
you're
who
talking
listen, I'm talking about all of you, right?
Yeah.
So
You people.
people like me
Yeah.
who can watch a phone for 5-minute increments of the wholesale market to try and make as much money as I can and turn off dishwashers and turn off like washing machines and turn down air conditioning. Like, it's not necessarily about the money, it's more just a hobby, right?
Sure.
Sometimes it's about the money, but mostly it's like, this is cool, like I get to do this, right? And that's why people bought Powerwalls back in the day, like when they first came out. Not because there's any kind of economic payback, but just
it's
because
a long payback. Yep.
well, there's no when it first came out, there's no payback. It was just cool. And I always say this. I think it's a misnomer to think that people always do what's logical. Sometimes people do things because they want to do things, not because it's necessarily the best or rational thing to do. There is a massive, massive part of the market that will just buy stuff cause.
Yep.
So I don't think we should underestimate that, right? So the early adopter crowd, I think, will be super engaged. I don't think they will have a problem with people controlling their vehicles if it delivers quite a bit of money down the track. It's the same people who are okay, you know, when Tesla release their robo-taxi service for them to like lease out their vehicles to a...
Sure.
Those same people. But for the vast majority of people who could not give a shit about their electricity, who set up a direct debit 3 years ago and forgot who their retailer
Still
was,
don't know.
right? And have no time to engage, what will those people do? Whose only interaction with electricity retailers, with the grid, is when something goes wrong. That's the only time they interact with them. Or when they move. And there's a reason why so many, you know, kind of, are you moving? Let me set up all of your bills. Right. There's a reason why so many retailers buy those companies, because that is actually one of the largest sources of incoming customers, right?
Absolutely.
It breaks the apathy cycle. So the question is, how do we make apathetic customers, right, engage with vehicle to grid, get them to sign these terms and conditions that says, hey, we're going to control your car and in exchange we're going to give you $300, $500, $600. Because make no mistake, like, it's not worth thousands and thousands of dollars per year, right?
We'll get to that.
Yeah. I would say for most people, they go, well, I don't really trust electricity. That's just a fact. That's like, we've got electricity companies as our clients. And I hope they don't mind saying, just objectively, right, we need to rebuild that trust with the electricity sector. But for these people, I go, they bought a new car, they're going to plug it in, right? There's a bi-directional charging station on the wall. The vast majority of the time, it's used to power the house, right?
Yep.
You're not paying any electricity bills for your house. Your electricity bill has gone from, you know, whatever it is, 500, 800, 1,000, 3,000, whatever it is, down to almost zero, right?
You've got solar on the roof.
You've got solar on the roof. You're one of like 30-something% of Australians who already have solar. And in 2035 or whatever it is, whenever AEMO predicts, you're one of you're one of the 50% who have solar on their roofs, right? You're one of the 4.5 million households who have solar.
Yep.
You have an electric car. You have bi-directional charging. You don't pay for your fuel bill. You don't pay for your electricity costs at home. When you have enjoyed such benefits and so much more money in your own pocket, the extra step of signing on to a traditional VPP, to give up that control, right? And then again, as we talked about, whether it's rational or not, that you will start to lose control of your vehicle, therefore start losing some of your benefits, right? People will just become suspicious and they go, well, my bills are already zero. This has been amazing for me. I don't need to go that extra step.
So it's this thinking that I assume inspired your opening comment that you think it's going to be the biggest generational wealth transfer from the corporate sector to consumers. It's this fact.
Yeah. And so, again, I run a business. I'm not here as like a consumer advocate trying to get everything for free for consumers. Like, JetCharge needs to make money. We need to return money to shareholders. We need to make a profit. So I'm not sitting here wishing for the downfall of the electricity sector, right?
And it never took you as an anarchist.
No. I just basically go, I try and be logical, right? The way that JetCharge tries to make money is we try and give consumers and customers, enterprise customers, what they want profitably.
Yep.
That's what we try and do, right? But we always start with what does the customer want and what is logical. I think it's really dangerous to go the other way, which is how do we maximize profits and then how do we try and push that onto the consumer and make them think it's a good idea? Because previously that was quite easy without the internet, right? Now people are savvy as F, right? People know their stuff, right? So my logic goes, if 1 in 3 households have solar, and in the future 1 in 2 have solar, and the average Australian household still has something like 1.7 to 1.8 vehicles, right? And all the vehicles are going to be electric in the future. And all of those electric vehicles will be capable of bidirectional charging. And bidirectional charging stations will either come with the car, be sold at the dealer, or be cheap enough for you to buy online, right? And all of the technology exists for you to just plug it in, and then all the technology algorithms just do their thing, charge when it needs, discharge into your house when it needs. If all of that is just set and forget, and you don't need to change actually any human behavior, then what occurs is instead of shifting the time of your electricity consumption, because right now for like solar, you consume solar during the middle of the day. If you don't have a battery, which most people don't, then obviously you have to use electricity at night. Yeah. But if you don't have to use that electricity at night because it's been stored in your electric vehicle, right? Then what that says to me is that 3 to 5 million households are able to, for the first time, generate enough electricity to store in their vehicles to cater for all of their vehicle and household electricity needs, because each vehicle can power a house for 2 days. So that means you're not taking electrons from one part of the grid and putting it in another part of the grid. You're not taking electrons from one time and using it another time. So that electron flow doesn't happen. You are self-generating, self-storing, and self-consuming. So what that means is that our entire electricity system, which is based on a transactional flow for electrons, loses millions of households worth of electricity, that profit, forever. And like the industry, including many who are stakeholders within JetCharge, like, because I've talked about this before publicly. You know, I've gotten into a lot of trouble for saying this. That like they don't think that this is going to happen. We don't think we've ever considered that scenario. Everyone will definitely participate in VPPs. This is never going to happen, Tim. You're being a shill. Like, and the only thing I have said is, I don't necessarily think I'm going to be correct. I'm just trying to be logical about it. And my biggest thing is there is a huge consequence for what happens if I'm right. Because if I'm right, or if I'm partially right, it means that the fixed overheads of running our grid will become a far greater burden on those households who can't afford solar bidirectional charging.
Equity issue. Can't
It's
afford
an equity
upfront
issue.
costs.
And this is my biggest point. This is my biggest problem. It's actually not, like, I'm very happy for the people who can afford to do those things. I'm in the fortunate position where I can probably afford to do those things. So it's not so much about the people who can do it. It's about the people who can't do it. Because, you know, our grid runs like, you know, pretty slowly in terms of change. Right? So we're talking literally decade-long cycles. And everything is based on modelling. Right? People actually build entire business cases based on modelling from AEMO, who's our national regulator for the market, right? For example, they look at their integrated systems plan and they go, this is where AEMO thinks there's going to be like opportunity, and I'm going to build an entire business for that. So if we've done no modelling on people literally not consuming electrons from the grid, then we actually don't know what the burden is going to be on that remaining 50%. And that's bad. I actually think that's really, really bad, because if you don't do that, you can't put in any policies, right? So like every corporate, including JetCharge, has a risk management framework, right? So we have, and we have to study risk every quarter, every couple of months to go, what are the risks? How do we mitigate that? If this is not a risk that we are considering, I think it should be, even if it is an outlier, because even if the likelihood is, say, low, the consequence is very high.
Sure.
So we need to start looking at it.
Definitely a future state that you've been talking about. In the sort of nearer term, though, consumers will still have a electricity utility, like a Origin or an AGL.
Yeah.
Won't they still have to interact through that utility to be able to gain these benefits, and therefore the cutout, I suppose, of the utility in wanting to provide grid benefits that they can monetize, given they have a fully integrated kind of load and supply? Like, how does that actually play out in the shorter term?
So in the shorter term, like I will say, I'm not advocating for people to go off grid either.
Yeah.
I've seen people comment on my things that say, "Oh, Tim's saying that everyone should avoid the grid." It's almost the complete opposite.
Yeah.
I don't think people should go off grid. I think the electricity grid is a vital piece of infrastructure for all of us, right? And we should all contribute to the upkeep. The way electricity bills work is that there's a connection fee, there's a consumption fee, there's a demand fee, and there's various regulatory charges, right? Of course, you're still connected to the grid, which means you're still paying the $1, $2, $3, whatever you pay, right? Connection charge or metering fee. So yes, you still pay for that. You'll always pay that. But you pay no consumption charges and you pay no demand charges. And the networks, the people who run our poles and wires, get that money through the retailers as well. So whilst you still have AGL, Origin, Energy Australia, Simple Energy, they're called Engie now, but like they will still bill you. The bills will just be a lot smaller. You hear all these stories about like, my power bill is zero, right? I've got solar on my roof. I've reduced my power bill by 80%. And it's on a current affair or whatever it is. That's going to happen for everyone. And so even
almost everyone. That's the issue. Yeah.
Let's just say it's going to happen for 30% of people. And so instead of becoming a newsworthy story that this one family has managed to reduce their household bill down to zero, it's going to affect 30% of Australians, and it will be business as usual, right? So I think you go that next logical step and say, well, if someone slashed their power bill by 80%, that means for that particular customer, right, that power company didn't get that 80%. And in a world where electricity retailers already operate on incredibly low margins, I know we all complain about power bills, but I think your average consumer would be very surprised by how little money per account a retailer makes. The big profits that you see, a lot of that comes from generation. It doesn't come from retail, right? The margin on retail is very tiny. Small. And so if a customer then reduces their power bill, even by 30%, even by 50%, that customer no longer makes money, right? So yes, they will still interact with the electricity retailers always, because they'll always be connected to the grid, but just the bill might be very small and therefore makes them not viable.
And so how in your mind are the large energy retailers thinking about this, and what are they doing about this? Because, I've always seen vehicle to grid or home, as we've been talking about, as, I don't know if I can swear on my own podcast, but it's going to be a shit fight. Because it's so transformative. And so all these players that exist, the energy players, as we said, the car manufacturers, there's always this sort of elephant in the room of like, wait, like a threat, like Google's going to get involved in this. They're good with this stuff. Like, what is the response going to be? And how are they currently responding to this kind of opportunity, but I suppose threat?
So the retailers are filled with very smart people.
Yeah.
You know a lot of them, Nick.
I do.
I know a lot of them. A lot of them feel very smart people. And so no one's sitting around a table with their head under the sand, right? So I think what's happening at the moment is there's a few ways we're all going about it. Well, I see them going about it. The first is that some of them are changing business models. so that they become a service-based business rather than a margin-based business. And so that's someone like Amber, right? They've said, we want you to lower your electricity bills and we'll become a SaaS business, which is what they are. I think it's like 20 or 30 bucks a month.
Subscription.
Right? Subscription, right? So in that situation, you just have to convince the consumer that you offer enough benefits through your technology platform, saves them enough money. And I think it's actually quite good because it aligns the company interests with consumer interests, right? Regardless of how little you use on your electricity, nothing changes for us as a business. And so therefore you can trust us to help you, right? So I think that's really good. There are other companies who shall remain unnamed, but I know looking to bake virtual power plants, which is just another fancy word for ability to control your stuff.
Yeah, well, ability to control an aggregated amount of stuff.
An aggregated amount of stuff. Let's be clear, for their own profit, number one,
Yeah.
right? And they want to embed that in the products that they sell you. Embed it. And so what they have found is, and I've learned more about this recently as well, is that whilst there isn't a high participation rate in virtual power plants on an opt-in basis, as is always the case, there is a very high participation rate when someone has to actively opt out. So when you go to one of these retailers and you buy solar through them, or you buy an inverter, or you buy a discounted battery from them, chances are, in the terms and conditions, they have de facto control over you, right? And so in that case, they have very high participation rates. And it'll be the same with cars. So if you buy a bi-directional charging station from them, if you buy a home charging station from them, chances are in the future, terms and conditions will say, you agree to participating in our VPPs, and this is kind of when we can discharge, blah, 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 blah. And I think that's definitely one way of them kind of encouraging, quote unquote, people to participate. And again, I'm in business. I'm not necessarily saying that's a good or bad thing. I'm saying it's a thing. And the debate that we need to have really is, do we want that? Like, do consumers want that? And when they wake up to it, do they actually feel comfortable with that? Because as someone said to me, I can't remember who it was, but they said, we can use consumer apathy to our advantage, right? So just because they're apathetic, they don't engage with us, they're also apathetic the other way in that they won't care that we're doing this with their stuff, right?
It's a big assumption.
Well, I also haven't decided whether it's like a good mentality to have. Do you know what I mean?
Well, it doesn't sound incredibly ethical. In a way, yeah.
Well, I just don't know,
Yeah.
right? And I'm sitting there going, I understand from a bottom line perspective why you would do this, but I'm always grappling with, is this the kind of world we want to be in, right? So I think that's what they're doing about it. I think a lot of the retailers, and I really admire some of the retailers and like how much they've thought about all of this, is a lot of them will move into more services-based models rather than margin-based models.
Well, a lot of this discussion so far has been, in a way, theoretical. I'd love to throw some numbers in here. I want to talk about economics. Let's talk about cost. What does a vehicle-to-grid charger cost now, and where could that cost trajectory kind of go? Obviously, implicit in the entire energy transition is the concept of learning rates. Solar and batteries, we're seeing it right now. It's kind of going pretty nuts on the battery side at the moment if you look at some of the numbers. But how should we think about cost for vehicle-to-grid charging?
Yeah, so everyone tells me vehicle-to-grid charging is too expensive. And I said to them, duh. It is expensive. If you wanted to buy a Wallbox Quasar last year, it would have been $10,000. And they're like, well, that's just way too expensive, which is true. And the reason it's too expensive is because there was one company in the Western world that made it and got it certified. So market forces, supply, demand, etc. It's very expensive right now. In the future, I've always said that it's going to be the cost of a good solar inverter, because bidirectional charging stations essentially are bidirectional inverters. It'll be the cost of a good solar inverter, and you can pick your brand as to which one you want. Plus the cost of the cable, because there's a cable that comes out of it, plus the cost of the plug, plus the cost of additional electronics inside the charging station. There's a bit more, and a bit more software in there. So you add that all up, and what does that equal? I would say in the next few years, probably something instead of 10,000, it'll be like 8,000, 7,000. And then once market forces come into play, there's a lot of competition and all of that stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if it falls under 5,000, even less.
Yep.
Think about where most inverters come from, right? And think about the fact that for them, it's actually not a technological challenge to make it into a bidirectional charging station. And so my prediction is that every single company that makes an inverter today for solar will have a bidirectional charging station within the next 5 years, every single one of them, right? Yep. And that's going to be great for consumers because it'll be quite cheap. So if you can buy a bidirectional charging station for, say, $3,000 to $5,000, I think then it becomes really, really compelling.
Yep.
And that's before we talk about, if the car manufacturers themselves include the bidirectional.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Then
is that if you're just taking a cost approach?
Yeah.
Like I imagine, based on what we're going to talk now about, which is next value.
Yeah.
What do you get for that cost?
Yeah.
But I imagine if you take it to your future state, your logical extreme, the vision from the AC pathway on board the car is, in my mind, that it could be the lowest cost option. Is that a valid way to think about it?
I think it's definitely the lowest cost option.
Yep.
I've seen the costs for a bidirectional onboard charger factory price that automakers pay. It's very cheap.
Could they, though, actually restrict the ability for their car to interact with the DC, with the external chargers in terms of trying to capture the field?
They can restrict anything they want.
Yep.
It actually gets quite existential.
Yeah, that's great.
It actually gets quite existential, but theoretical is when you have to certify a charging station, right? There's a big ability for companies in that country, for the country itself to control those devices. When it's a vehicle and everything, all the smarts are inside the vehicle, you almost start losing some of that sovereignty because there's so much power in the actual vehicle in terms of how it interacts. There is some question as to which one is preferable from a kind of national interest perspective. But yeah, they can absolutely restrict power flows. They can do whatever they want in the vehicle. And actually in the US, a bunch of the US vehicle manufacturers advocated for non-smart chargers.
Okay.
And relied purely on the vehicle for smarts.
Okay.
And the only thing, and they say that's because, smart chargers are 20% more expensive than non-smart chargers. So why would you pay that extra 20%? Let us concentrate that in the vehicle. Right? Which is obviously bullshit. Like it's just to concentrate power. But yeah, there's no doubt that it's much cheaper to have an AC charging station on the wall that doesn't cost a lot and to have all of that smarts in the vehicle.
Yep. But I suppose going to earlier comments about what the Americans are doing, it may well be all driven by what happens in China, given the kind of impact they might have on future vehicle sales.
Yeah.
Let's talk about value.
Yeah.
What you get for that cost.
Yeah.
This discussion is mainly focused on kind of the value that the homeowner gets.
Yeah.
But there also potentially is value to the grid. So how should we think about the stack of value benefits that vehicle to grid actually bestows?
So if you have solar and you have a vehicle that parks at home at least once every 2 days, right? So that you can charge your vehicle from solar and you've got enough excess solar to charge your vehicle, then in terms of value, what we've seen is anywhere between 80 to 100% reduction in your power bill.
Okay.
So whatever you pay for power, unless you have huge homes where, you can't actually supply that home using the battery pack in the vehicle alone.
You could have 2 cars.
You could have 2 cars, yeah. Well, those huge homes probably have 10 cars. So, for most people, it's going to lead to a reduction 80 to 100%. So whatever your electricity bill is, and again, not everyone knows how much their electricity bill is because this directive, but whatever your electricity bill is, take that down to 0. That's the value. And if a bidirectional charging station installed is, say, even in the short to medium term, $7,000, and just look at your power bill and go, do I make that back?
Yep.
Right? And that's without, obviously, the backup generation kind of benefits as well, right? So there's both an emotional kind of thing as well as a security thing where you get backup generation as well as a money thing.
Yep. But jumping the fence, though, into the grid.
Yeah.
These corporates, the distribution companies, etc.
Yeah.
How are they thinking about the almost additional value. Surely there's values we've discussed in them just staying and consuming more that isn't going through the vehicle to grid.
Yeah.
But we talk about things like energy arbitrage for them, FCAS, things like that.
Yeah.
What's the value of those things?
So if you look at some of and I've heard Chris from Amber talk about this, but they've got customers who've made like $2,000 a year, right?
Wow, okay.
Like, I hope he doesn't mind me saying, I think it's an outlier. They've actually done quite big trials on this in overseas markets, especially in the UK and across parts of Europe. And they found that the average for the home, the average value of vehicle to grid is around about $300 to $500 per year.
Per year.
Yeah.
On the grid side.
On the grid side. Yeah.
Which is a pretty long payback if there's a corporate model which is saying, hey, I'll give you this on a subscription basis or for free.
Yeah.
And my return will be, in theory, let's call it a 10-year payback.
Yeah.
Not super attractive, but I imagine what they're actually thinking about there is the stickiness of that customer. The ability for them to keep consuming.
Keep in mind, those numbers is the money that goes back to consumers.
Sure. Yeah. So what's on the other side of the 300 to 500?
Not sure yet. Yeah, they don't publish those numbers. And I'll also say that the Australian electricity grid is a little bit different. And because we're obviously an islanded grid, the value stack might be different.
Yep.
There was some really good research done on what it's worth for homeowners. I can't remember the exact amount. I think it was about $600.
Yep.
So the big question for consumers is let's just call it $600. For $600, will you give up control? That's the big question. And I would actually say, as someone who knows a lot of the people in these electricity companies developing the technology, that the chances of your vehicle being empty, for example, or you not being able to drive your car, or there's some other issue that is very low.
Well, partly it's because most of the value seems to be in the sort of FCAS services or grid services where they don't actually involve you taking everything out of the battery.
Yeah, sure.
It's more of in my mind, it's always like a little flutter every so often.
To support
absolutely.
The grid. Absolutely. And you can imagine how little FCAS is going to be worth if the vast majority of our vehicles are capable of FCAS in the long term.
Yeah.
I do think, though, it could be worth, it just depends, right? Everyone talks about FCAS, but nobody really knows how much it's going to be worth in the long term.
Billions of dollars of investment that is going into batteries and some of the thinking around vehicle to grid, all relying on the size of this FCAS pie, and either expanding or otherwise. But the amount of effective future competition baked into everyone competing for that.
Yeah.
My simple brain, without being close enough to the detail to make anything sort of that learned about it, is that there's not enough pie to go around based on all the investment going into assuming that will be part of their payback.
Well, it just depends on how volatile our grid gets.
True.
And so if our renewables don't get built out fast enough, or if our transmission don't get built out fast enough, or if, everything forbid, we decide to abandon our short-term renewable plans in favour of long-term nuclear.
Well, hang on. We're 50 minutes in, I think, here, and we've finally said the nuclear word. I thought it was going to come earlier. I didn't want to say it, but yeah.
But if genuinely our grid becomes quite volatile because of policy decisions like that, then the FCAS market's going to be worth a lot. So I think there is a space there. We just don't know exactly how big the opportunity is.
Yeah. Ellen Liang, you've just been patiently having to listen to your husband for the last hour, just chat away. Has that been a brutal experience for you? Maybe that's the first question.
Can I be very honest?
Yeah.
I was not listening at all.
That happens a lot.
I would say I tuned out for a bit too, but it's not true. I shouldn't say that. The question I wanted to ask you is, what's it like running one of Australia's preeminent climate tech companies as a husband and wife team?
It's fine. It's a very anticlimactic answer, but it's fine.
Yeah.
Because, I think we just got lucky, right? Because you never know. You never know. You always take a huge leap going into these kind of massive endeavours, and you just don't know whether you'll actually get along with the person, whether your working styles will mesh, any of that. And that's true of whether it's your husband or whether it's your best friend or whatever.
Yep.
And I think we just are lucky that it worked out, because we are very different people, but at the same time, very similar people. And so when you have the same values but different ways of looking at the world, it actually feeds exactly into what makes a really great operating kind of couple. Because and this is really almost the benefit of diversity, period.
Absolutely.
Right? In boardrooms and in companies, because you come at it with the same values, but because of your different life experiences, because of the different way that your brain works, you actually come to better decisions.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, on a day-to-day basis, Tim and I we arrive at the office together and then we don't see each other again until we go home.
And what's your role at the company?
So my role at the company, the official title is Head of Legal and Corporate Affairs.
Yep.
What it means in practice is that I look after the legal team, I look after the marketing team, and I also look after almost this kind of de facto transformation kind of function of the business, where basically if there are big, I guess, operational gaps in the company, I will come in and execute and implement on that.
And does being head of legal mean that your role is, the title for your role is like keeping Tim in check?
This line of questioning sucks.
Not really. No. Yeah. I think, I mean, we both started off as lawyers. That's how we met.
Yeah.
And so actually there is, mostly trust there.
Yeah.
That Tim will actually sort of look at a problem, like looking at risks as well as the opportunities. No, not really.
Yeah.
I think the training that you get, because I started at Herbert Smith Freehills, the training that you get is that you are, as a corporate lawyer, you are a commercial thinker.
Absolutely. Yep.
Right? And so, yeah, not really.
She doesn't let me look at the contracts, though. She doesn't rate my skills as a lawyer, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And maybe final question just to wrap up. We always ask this. I was going to ask it to Tim, but I'd rather ask it to you now and put you on the spot. We're called The Positive Climate, so we focus on solutions that are out there that are going to make a real difference. Is there anything that you've come across lately, whether in the EV sector or otherwise, that makes you feel positive about the future climate transition?
I don't know if you guys, because I genuinely wasn't listening, but I don't know if you already covered this, but the latest article on V2G and the fact that this project that JetCharge worked on, that we were the technical sort of leads for.
Yep. Is that the REVS project?
Yeah, that's right. The trial has actually finished, but the vehicles are still connected to the grid. And so basically a grid frequency drop happened in February.
Yep.
And 19 of the Nissan Leafs basically kicked in and actually supported the grid.
Yep.
And, we tested this and it was successful as part of the trial, but this was in the real world, it worked. And it was successful.
Yep.
And Bjorn from ANU wrote a great article about it. And so, that is hugely exciting.
Absolutely.
Right? It's like this tiny little kind of sort of indicator, right? It's kind of like this beacon that just kind of flashed in time, but it signifies like this future. We at JetCharge, we talk about this concept of energy freedom, right? And I think particularly for consumers, this is the beacon, right?
Yep.
Of energy freedom. Like this is the potential and the opportunity that it's going to actually realise for all of Australia and all of the world. So it's, very, very exciting.
Awesome. Great answer.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Nick.
There's a new segment that we've brought to A Positive Climate this season. It's called Uncomfortable Questions.
Yeah.
We have a panel of skeptics. We don't really. But here are some very unprepared questions for you that you're going to have to... Let's think of it like a speed round.
Okay.
I'll throw this across the desk.
Do it. Given the materials that go into EVs, should jumbo cars like the Hummer EV be outlawed? Wow. There's both a personal opinion. I really dislike very large cars.
Yeah.
But that's just a personal opinion. Whether they should be outlawed, I guess my answer is, look, probably not. You're just going to create too much backlash, right? I do think to a certain extent that if you can encourage people into more sensible sized vehicles, we should definitely do that. But I don't really think it should be outlawed, even though it's not my own personal taste.
Okay, good answer. There's the next one.
In the year 2050, how many vehicle sales in the passenger segment will be hydrogen? 0.
I thought you might say that. All right, next one.
Okay.
I'm actually pretty happy at how well this.
This is great.
The frisbeeing of these palm cards.
You're very good at flicking the card. I feel like you've been watching too many trick shot TikToks.
I don't know who wrote these, but yeah, I'll find out one day.
How much of EV sales growth has been reliant on subsidies? Interesting. I don't know the exact number. I would say quite a bit because subsidies, people don't buy vehicles because of subsidies. People buy vehicles because of price. And so what I mean by that is subsidies are there just to achieve an end, right? Which is a lower price. But we've seen now that actually a lot of the vehicles coming through the pipe are able to hit a really good price point without subsidies. So when that happens, I think the subsidies probably won't matter as much.
Okay, that's a good answer. We almost covered this on the core chat.
Will lower socioeconomic Australians be locked out of the EV transition if they don't have a garage and can only use public charging? This is actually a pet topic of mine. I find this future quite troubling because we've actually seen it already happen in the UK. So in the UK, you'll remember that they announced the ban of internal combustion engine vehicles from 2030 or 2035. And there's a lot of people in the UK who can't park in a garage. They park on the street, right? And public charging costs anywhere between 2, 3, 4 times the cost of home charging. And so it's not even just about the lower socioeconomic Australians, but it's actually about anyone who doesn't have off-street parking will end up paying a lot more for their fuel bill, right? Why? Why is that fair? That's not fair, right? If I can't afford to buy a house with a garage, why should I actually have to pay 3 times more? That's ridiculous. And so I think that's something that we really, really have to solve. I don't know the answer to that. I'm hoping with increased competition in the public charging space that actually the cost will come down. And so I think there's, we're talking to a lot of partners and they've got lots of good ideas on how they can bring the cost of public charging down. But I do think if we don't solve that, there is a risk that we're putting too much financial burden on those without a driveway.
Well, and I think this is an issue that is extended through the whole climate transition. Like obviously, pick solar. Some of the same issues are being seen there. You need to own a home to put solar on your roof. You need to be able to afford the upfront cost of the solar, even though it's a bit lower than like an EV. But certainly some of the costs of that solar coming into the grid are being dispersed across those that can't afford solar. And I do think as the industry, the broader climate transition industry, we need to be kind of thinking about these issues up front as opposed to just trying to work it out later.
I think there's a broad base, like the industry as a whole tends to go, it's too hard. Let's not focus on that just yet. And I'm sometimes guilty of that as well. I'm just like, let's convert the first 50% and worry about the rest later. But increasingly, I actually think it is to the industry's benefit, like our whole of industry benefit, by being honest with ourselves on these issues and tackling them early. I think that's really, really important because if you look at what people respond to, even if you were thinking about this purely selfishly as an evil corporate, even if you were thinking just purely on those lines, it is very true these days that consumers respond well to authenticity and honesty. And if you are a corporate who comes out and says, we don't have the answers, but we're willing to debate these issues and we're willing to come up with solutions for these issues, even though they don't impact on our bottom line right now, you will probably get higher engagement and higher sales just for that. So I think it's probably to all our corporate benefits that we just have these conversations now and try and solve them.
Well, I think there's certainly something about the whole media industry that relates to that around these, certain corporates that do very formal press releases.
Yeah.
Others like yourselves that are doing, selfie videos to TikTok and actually talking about, gives a bit of personality behind
That's
the
just
actual
a
brand.
low marketing budget. That's not out of choice.
Sounds like a positive climate then. So maybe wrapping up, just back to vehicle to grid, maybe wrap this up all together.
Yeah.
How should people be thinking about how cars will power their homes through the period through, say, 2030?
To a certain extent, I don't actually think people even need to think about it. I actually think that when they buy the vehicle, especially for people who are first to market with a true bi-directional charging vehicle, they'll get the charger for free.
Yeah.
Or it'll be included in the price, or they get a discount from the dealer. I think they will buy the car. It'll be capable. I think they'll get the charger when they buy the car. I think it'll come with an installation service, hopefully from Jet Charge, to kind of install it in the home. And I think it'll just work. I actually think for a lot of these things, technology will mean it just works. And it is therefore actually the deeper thinking needs to come from industry, not from consumers, because I think for consumers, it'll just be part of their normal car buying experience in the future.
Yep. That's a fantastic way to wrap up. Tim, awesome to have you back on. Look forward to 3 years' time when we're talking about, wireless charging or battery swapping, perhaps. Who knows?
Awesome.
But thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.